the poet. Life's an everyday adventure. That's my philosophy. My grandmother is one of the greatest people in the world. She not only visits us as often as she can, but she also sends us gifts. In the mail today, we received from my grandmother gift certificates to our favorite neighborhood bookstore. My mother and I were so excited, we headed to town right away. On the way to the bookstore, we decided to surprise my father with a new mystery book. When we arrived, the bookstore was really crowded, but we found our way through the crowds to the mystery section. My mother quickly found my father's favorite author's books, and we grabbed the newest one. My father would be so happy. Next, we went to find a book for my mother. She likes real stories about real people, so we went to the biography section. Wow! There were so many books about so many interesting people. My mother found lots of books she really wanted to read, but finally chose one to take today. I wasn't sure what kind of book I wanted, but luckily the kids section has everything. Books for kids are very different than grown-up books. Kids' books are way more fun. We sat and looked through tons of books. Finally, I found the one. A book of drawings by kids from all around the world. Each drawing had its own story. Cool. I couldn't wait to get home and get into my new book, as my father would say. As we were getting ready to leave, I noticed something. The wall of books I was looking at moved. It wasn't a wall of books. It was a secret door to a secret room. My toes were tingling like hummingbird wings in my moccasins as people poured out of the secret room. Where are all of those people coming from? I asked the lady behind the counter. They were here for a poetry reading by the famous poet Nanabel, she answered. My mother and I looked at each other and shrugged. We had never heard of Nanabel. We watched until the last person came out. It was an old lady with a pile of books in her arms. My mother ran to help her. "Why, thank you, dear. I have written more than I can carry now," the old lady said, smiling. My mother smiled, too, as she placed the books on the counter for her. I couldn't believe it. I blurted out, "You wrote all of these books?" She giggled a little and said, "Well, young lady, these are my collections of poems. I am a poet, and apparently I know it." She giggled again. I had never met a poet, and I wasn't exactly sure I knew what poetry was, so I asked her. Nanabel told me that poets have special powers of imagination to help us think or feel things in a different way. She also said that poetry is like music and art and dance, but with words. My head was spinning with questions. Nanabel said the best way to explain poetry was to let me experience it. She borrowed a pen and a piece of paper from the lady at the counter and wrote something down. She looked at me, smiled, then folded the little piece of paper and pressed it into my hands. Nanabel continued holding my hands as she said, "You will find that poems can be in many forms. They can be long or short, rhyming or not. But all poetry will try to do something. See what this little poem does for you. It says, 'Everything I see seems to smile at me.' Take it with you today and notice how it makes you feel or how it changes the way you see things." My mother carried our new books, and I held the little poem tightly in my hand. As I looked around, I thought about the poem and realized Nanabel was right. I saw the world smiling at me. First it was the sunflower, then the trees. Even the clouds and sun were smiling at me. Wow! When we got home, I tried to look at my new book, but I couldn't stop thinking about the poem Nanabel gave me. I started singing her poem. "Everything I see seems to smile at me." Then I began dancing to it outside. The poem suddenly seemed to be everywhere and part of everything I was doing. I was so happy that I decided I wanted to be a poet. I quickly lay down on the grass and looked up at the sky. I thought I might find a poem up there. After a few minutes, I couldn't think of anything, so I rolled over. Right next to me was the dog lying down sleeping. I stared at her until... I see it! I feel it! I hear it in my head! My first poem. The dog looks like a log sleeping next to a frog. Amazing! I ran around the backyard singing and dancing to my very first poem. My parents came outside to join me. I told them about my poem, and we all held hands and danced and sang in a circle. The dog joined in too. I may not be a famous poet, but poetry got my family to sing and dance outside. Poems are awesome! Meeting Nanabelle the poet and learning about poetry was truly terrific. Now I know that poems can help us see, hear, and feel things in all kinds of new and fun ways. Molly Moccasins, Everyday Adventurer.